Welcome to Cultivate, a Veritas Academy podcast, where we explore truth, beauty, and goodness through meaningful conversation. We invite you to join us in discussions meant to edify your mind, encourage your heart, and equip your family to live abundantly in Christ.
Welcome back to Cultivate. I'm Ty Fischer, head of school here at Veritas Academy, and I am really thankful today to have one of our alumni. Now, I've had a few podcasts with recent alumni, folks who are maybe just graduated from Veritas or just headed off to college, and that is always a lot of fun. Today, I'm interviewing an alumni that is a little bit further out than that. I'm privileged to be here to talk with John Hayward. John is a Veritas graduate, and just recently, after serving in classical Christian schools for a number of years, just recently was called and installed as the senior pastor at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Harrisburg. So, Pastor Hayward, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I take every opportunity. Like, you didn't call me an old alumni, but I'll take it as that. I take every opportunity to be called old.
What year did you graduate?
2008.
2008. And as you can know, before this podcast, I was giving John a tour of our school. And as it happens with old alumni sometimes, you know, I'm always excited about the new things and the changes. And John's like, well, what happened to the old tiles on the floor? And I'm like,
what happened to the asbestos?
Yeah, what happened to the asbestos? And the answer is all the asbestos tiles in the new hallways are gone.
Let the record and code note. It is all gone.
Okay. Today, what I wanted to talk with John about, and he and I talk pretty often, and so we're hoping that we can plow a straight furrow, but we know that furrow is probably going to get wiggly, and as the Spirit leads, it will. Because today I'd like to talk about sensing God's calling. So, John, before we start, though, talk a little bit about when did you graduate from Veritas? Kind of give everybody a walk through your life from when you were a student here to the calling that you're serving in now. As I remember, you were the only
boy in my class. I was the only boy in my class for all of high school.
Wow, that's incredible.
It was an education in and of itself.
I bet it was.
Yeah, myself and 6 or 7 girls. Yeah, it shaped me in wonderful ways. And I would say one of the things, and we'll just start right there, one of the things that happened, so I got fed up with the women in my class, probably 11th grade year. And I repented and restored those relationships senior year. But 11th grade year, I was just kind of done. So I started to eat lunch every day with my teachers and not my classmates, and that proved to be an excellent influence in my life.
And I didn't know that was happening on an everyday basis.
Yeah, basically every day.
Which a lot of the teachers that you would have been men, so you were just trying to hang out with the guys because there weren't any guys in your class.
Yeah, it was a great blessing. So like my life between like Veritas and now. Yeah, so I left Veritas to go to Grove City College to study history and all things that would prepare me to be a classical Christian school teacher.
Okay.
Because my dream was to go away and graduate and then come back and teach at Veritas.
Wow.
And while I was in college, I did that. So Grove City College was an excellent place to do, especially their history department. History department's the best in the nation at Grove City. We're top 5, maybe.
Okay.
But it's pretty great. It's pretty great.
I was on campus the day they hired Carl Truman, and I was like, I wanted to go back and be a student again.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're pretty great. And what they're great about is they make people read texts carefully, and then you have to write lots of big papers. Oh, well, I won't make this an advertisement for Grove City College's history department. But so there, I was successful. That was I did. I history majored and then took a variety of classes in philosophy and literature and Bible and just every general thing, because I knew that classical Christian school humanities teachers had to be generalists. But personally, in my relationship with the Lord, a church, being plugged into Christ Pres out in Grove City really changed the spiritual trajectory of my life in some very important ways. And through getting mentoring, I then sought to begin to take some seminary classes just for like personal enrichment. And then seeing how taking those classes, specifically counseling classes through the Christian Counseling Educational Foundation, my junior year, and how that changed my relationships my senior year. I was serving as chaplain of a group on campus, and just little hints of that began to, senior year of college, make me think about the ministry.
And for those of you who don't know kind of Western Pennsylvania or around Grove City there are a lot of Presbyterians that are there. So if you think about Grove City, there's almost every variety of Presbyterian church, but I think the church that you were involved in was a new church from the ARP,
It was
right?
a church plant
Associate
from the ARP.
Reform.
Yeah.
Which is mainly, I think, a Southern denomination.
North and South Carolina, or where its
okay.
main hub is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and you were one of the early people involved at that church, right?
Yeah. My first service there was their second public service.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So
what do you know?
I was the chairman, so I would move the chairs.
Oh, I was like, I was thinking.
Show up early, move the chairs.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Good job being a chairman, John.
Yeah, at a young age, chairman of a church.
Took a leadership position right there.
Yeah.
In fact, many pastors would like there to be more chairmen in their church.
So senior year, I began to think that way, and I would say I was always very comfortable with a long-term vision of entering pastoral ministry. So it was never that my goal was, now I feel this call to ministry. Well, I need to go to seminary right away. I need to get a pastorate right away. Because I had just, in the very natural, easy flow of, the hour and 15-minute omnibus classes that we had back then, right? The discussion just had come up. And several of teachers had mentioned that, they're wondering, maybe the Lord will call me into ministry for a while. So for me at that time, right, being like a 17, 18-year-old, hearing a 44-year-old say, I think the Lord might call me into ministry, as time goes on, which just kind of set an influence that, faithfulness to God's calling in your life is not a high school thing, a college grad thing. It's the Lord will guide and open doors throughout the whole length of it. So in college, as I had that sense of a call to ministry, it wasn't I need to completely change everything in my life now. It's just we'll see. Maybe the Lord will use these gifts.
So the teachers here kind of looking at you and then projecting forward, there's some of the people that might have put that on your mental table to say, hey, maybe this is something that God might call you to in the future.
No, not at that time. It was the model of them reflecting about themselves.
Okay.
So this was like a 40-year-old at the time speaking. I think I might be a pastor someday.
Okay.
Right. So having a 40-year-old, a 17-year-old saying someday has a different kind of I don't know, big picture mindset, as opposed to a 44-year-old saying, someday, right? It just planted a seed of, long-term faithfulness and shaping. And I had that model too. There was a man at Westminster who entered the ministry later in life and had a very fruitful and still has very fruitful ministry, but he didn't start going to seminary until his mid-40s. Well,
and John, you served as a teacher here at Veritas for a while, and then as the dean of various things at Covenant Christian School, or Covenant Christian Academy in Harrisburg. So you were dean of everything secondary?
Yeah, so I was hired as upper school dean, but kind of functioned as upper school dean and academic dean, and then was upper school dean and interim grammar school dean, and it turns out also director of early education for a season. But then I ended my time there for 2 years, just returning to upper school dean and academic dean again.
Okay. And then called to Trinity.
Yeah.
So was it in those classes that you took as in college, those counseling classes, where you started to sense that maybe that thing that those teachers were talking about here at Veritas and probably at colleges as well? I mean, I know at Grove City so many teachers are plugged in various ways to churches, but is that when you started to say maybe that thing that teacher that I talked to is feeling might be something that I'm feeling as well, or that God's leading me in that
so it was
direction?
definitely senior year of college. So I came under, in good old Presbyterian language. I came under care of our local presbytery in 2012. Started the process even before I started working here.
Okay.
And then while I was working here, I was doing seminary, off and on, part-time, full-time. And then, after becoming the dean at Covenant, I finished up my languages. So it wasn't actually until fall of 2020 that I actually had gathered all of the credentials that the PCA would expect for someone who's ordained. But during that time, I'd been preaching. I've been licensed to preach, been preaching more, doing a variety of things.
Well, and your family you always been part of the Presbyterian Church in America, the PCA. So
me, yeah.
So, and in some ways, that calling, I know that God calls different people from different backgrounds, but some of, when I think about you, the church is not an uncomfortable place for you to be. It's always been kind of a comfortable place for you to be.
Well, no, that definitely would be an exaggeration because, right. I would say when I probably starting in 5th grade, I began to rebel theologically from my church. Right. So Mr. Cease was a Baptist. So I became a Baptist. Right. Like the teachers
here at Veritas were messing with you, huh?
No, I don't think it was. I do not blame. Well, I could, if we wanted to, I could find back the specific things that I would blame them for. But I would say my heart deserves most of the blame. Right. So for a good season, I have a paper that I wrote in 8th grade where I was just an avowed, clear, Arminian. Right, kind of very much saying absolutely this is not the case, but I would say I kind of settled down into more stable biblical convictions over time. Just kind of kept reading. Honestly, I was not reading the Bible at the time. Kept finding good teachers by God's grace who would tell me what the Bible taught, and then when I looked at it, it seemed to make sense to me. But I was hypercritical of my church, so I would go through.
When did that change? Because most of my experience with you, as a high school student, I never really felt that.
Oh yeah, this is great. So I'll tell you exactly when it began to change. So I was hypercritical, right? I had lots of thoughts about how the church could be better, and I told them to. Shout out to Troy DeBruin, being very patient and long suffering. Right?
Who was the one who preached the charge?
He did
at your installation service.
Yeah. So I was hypercritical, kind of man, this church is stupid. It doesn't do this right. Doesn't do this right. Man, it's just so awful. It doesn't really take culture seriously. All sorts of things. Very easy to just throw stones. Make lots and lots of criticisms. And then, I was either parasitically or kind of taking themes that I heard in my omnibus classes and things like that, and then just applying them as weaponizing them against my church. So, sometimes,
that was not the intention of Veritas Academy.
Let the record show. That was not So, right. So, so I definitely used it that way. And so in 11th grade year, probably around March or so.
Okay.
While we were doing an independent study, right, you and me, in European history, I made one of my super snarky criticisms about my church to you, thinking that you'd be like, yeah, I know your church is stupid. But instead what you said is John, you shouldn't talk about your church that way. And then I immediately said, it's not my church. Because I had gone through the communicants class there and said, I don't want to join. I do not want to submit myself to these elders. I do not want to seek the peace and purity of this church. So I at least had the integrity at that time to say.
You were still in the dialectic stage there, John.
Oh yeah, I had a long conversation with my elders, and just I'm not going to join after this because I don't want to. I can't say these vows in good conscience. So I didn't. Right, and then and then I told you oh, it's not my church. I didn't join. I
don't remember that.
Why would I associate with those people? Well, I tell this story a lot, so it's good I can tell it to you, right? And then you just kind of made the comment. You kind of turn your head, a little bit sideways like you do, and then you said, "Well, John, the confession says there's no ordinary means of salvation outside of the church."
Right.
And that conversation and that just stuck.
Yeah.
So
that's Cyprian originally.
And you also made at some point during that year a comment of, if you really want to influence the church, John, you should probably start serving it. So those two comments, junior year of high school, towards the end of junior year. So May of my junior year of high school, I joined Westminster and started to attend church more regularly. And then it began to change my life. And that what started the trajectory that then, being a part of a smaller, intimate community in college, really began to work things out.
Wow. John, yeah. I'm glad you told me that story. I did not know it. I think I remember you joining the church, but I think I had connected that to to different things.
Yeah.
But I stand by what I said. And the great thing is, I think that once that reproach happened, you actually did take serving in the church seriously.
Yeah.
And
Nursery.
yeah,
And attending. I'd say, well, the very biggest foundational change was I took attending church seriously after that.
Yeah.
Right. No longer the how often can I convince my parents to find a way for me to not go, but just like, I'm going to be there. And, I need a ride. I need this. I need that, to make sure that I'm just there.
Oh, you've made, John, you've made me a very happy man already during this podcast. But when was it that you started to sense that God's calling in a way that it was not like ministry might be something that's, 30 years out there, but it might be ministry is something that I'm going to look to pursue now.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about all Christians do ministry or should be doing ministry, right?
Yeah.
But this is but to be a pastor.
Yeah, so I would say it definitely grew out of the former that you said, right? So I had all sorts of thoughts about church, and criticized Westminster, right? But then I joined the church, right? I still held a lot of those convictions, but just realized, Jesus doesn't take it probably well if you like trash talk his wife all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of like joining, being a part of it, beginning to live in it. I had this conviction of like church is the kingdom of heaven on earth. It should be a priority. It should be a defining thing of one's life. That is the good life. The good life is being plugged into the church, right? I heard William Taylor recently say, right, like whatever your vocation is, right, whether it's, banker, builder, whatever, you're not a builder that happens to be a Christian. You're a Christian that happens to be a builder.
Right.
And so just letting that be kind of like the core essential identity was something that had been shaped into me. So then when I began to see myself, one, being blessed by the ministry of this local church in a way that just the Lord was using it very fruitfully in my life, and then just having this aspiration to, I want to be a blessing like that to other people, and beginning to get tastes of that my senior year in college in like the dorm room conversations. I led a weekly Bible study, things like that. So then I wanted to continue to pursue that. And so again, I would say I aspired to it. Right, so Paul says, if someone aspires to the office of overseer, and he aspires to a noble thing. Mm-hmm. So I just took that very seriously and say, hey, like not every, it was always encouraging to me when I found that not everyone wants it. So like when I was like, okay, so like, I need to take this seriously, that I do aspire to serve the church in that pastor, shepherding, elder capacity. And I'd say I was very Presbyterian, right? So saying not all people who are called to serve the church as an elder are called to be vocationally set aside as ministers. And so I was, while I was saying, okay, I need to faithfully pursue all the credentials for ordination, and I loved it too. I loved being in seminary.
That is a good help too.
It did help. It did help. As far during some rough seasons where I was really wondering, like, should I just I'm being fruitful in a small Christian school context. Like, should I just continue that fruitfulness? Right, and saying, I'm just going to keep taking the next step. But I would say as I served in ministry, got to do more counseling, more teaching, and then from 2015 on, somewhat regular preaching opportunities, I would say seeing the fruitfulness there, a lot of it just came down to a core conviction of, do I believe? Like because I would regularly wrestle. Like I'm being fruitful as the upper school dean at Covenant Christian Academy. I'm being fruitful in my home life and plugged into church. Right? Like why am I thinking about changing fields? Is it just discontent? Right? And a lot of it came down to, I just asked myself, like, is the preaching of God's word important? Is it important to the health of the church? Is it important to the growth of the kingdom, to inspiring people to spread the word about Jesus Christ as Lord throughout all the ends of the earth? And the answer was yes. I do believe the Bible teaches that preaching of the word is important. And then so being set aside as a minister of the word to feed, to shepherd, to care for, right? And then being free from kind of like the worldly cares and responsibilities that a church sacrificially gives to allow me to do that just sounded too good to be true.
Wow.
Then I got a phone call.
Okay.
So there's stuff in the story in between there, of course.
And that's what I wanted to go into next. Both of us have had time in seminary, and as I knew, sometimes in seminary when they would always talk about, they want us to talk about our internal calling, and I had an internal calling that and I was very open. I went to seminary thinking that possibly God would use me as a minister or maybe a teacher in some context. But when they came around to me and said, talk about your calling, I would say, well, I went to college and I thought I was going to go to law school, and I found that I was, just kept reading about theology and about God. So I love it. And I think, I went to my minister and he said, I think God's calling you to go to seminary. And I got here to seminary, and boy, it's wonderful. And I really like it. And then they would go to the next guy and he said, I heard a voice. I heard a voice one night. And I was like, man, if I could have just heard a voice one night. And then I thought, if you heard a voice one night as a Presbyterian, you might think, did the pizza cause it, or like so
I call that the Joel Beakey, Carl Truman spectrum, because at Westminster Seminary when I was there, we had Joel Beakey as a speaker, and Carl Truman was there, and they did like this panel on like how do you get a chance to call pastor call, and like Joel Beakey had it was almost like even like a light and a voice. Almost like a light and a voice moment where he's like, I must be set aside to be a minister of thy word, O Lord, right? Because he always used the King James, right? And then Carl Truman's like, well, I was at this church. I like the church. And they needed a pastor. And I'm like, okay, I think I can preach.
Yeah.
And I guess I should step up and like fill this need. And then he did it for 6 years, and now he's still a teaching elder, but now he's no longer serving as minister. And he's kind of like, yeah, well, I think I was fruitful. I think I faithfully preached, did a fine job. But just kind of that's the spectrum that I use in my mind, and I'm closer to Carl Truman.
Yeah, no, I'm there with Carl Truman as well. But the that internal call, then you can have that very strongly. But what you and I often talk about is the phone also has to ring. Yeah, like there has to be an external call.
That's kind of you say we. Like you just gave me that line earlier in my life, so I just stole it from you.
The external call is when the phone rings. If the phone doesn't ring, you haven't had an external call at this point.
Well, and that's where like I received the affirmation of people. They liked my preaching. They liked my teaching. I saw fruit from my counseling ministry, right? Both with students, but then also just with peers and different things in just ministry to our church. So Bobby Jameson wrote a book published by Crossway, part of the 9-Mark series, called The Path to Ministry, a guide for the aspiring. Because the Bible uses that language of aspire to an office. And I think that's more helpful. Because sometimes people use the word call, or what's my calling in life. And I think it gets really complicated and messy really quickly. Because someone's calling, right? If we use the word call, I forget what the word, if it's an intransitive verb or something like that. But there's someone doing a calling if you have a call. And it's like, well, or maybe you're just calling yourself. So the idea of aspiration is a very personal thing of like, I am aspiring. And then do other people think that I should aspire to this? Do I have the gifts to aspire to it? Because even like if you think of the general high schooler trying to figure out what do I do with my life? Well, the general 35-year-old thinking, what should I do with my life?
Right.
There can be a sense of like, oh, what's God's calling to my life? And I just want to say God's calling to your life is really clear. You could start by reading the book of Romans or John's gospel or Matthew 28, right? You could like God doesn't actually hide. God is not sending you on like Blue's Clues, like Dora the Explorer.
I was thinking of National Treasure, but
you
have younger children, right?
Yeah, they do not watch those shows. right. So they kind of like the idea that God's sending you on a treasure hunt, and it's like, oh, like what if you get the clue wrong? What if you misread the clue, right? So it can get the sense of like, oh, am I outside of God's will? Am I really? And then the answer is like, no, and like, God actually expects us to read His Word thoroughly, search it, listen to wise counselors, and then make decisions.
Well, but one of the things that I don't know if people know, it's that for a lot of, there are denominations, and I think the Presbyterian Church in America is one of them, where there are a ton more people with ministerial credentials than there are like pulpits to fill and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So there's a patience that has to be there as well as you're waiting for the phone call to happen. And I know over the last few years, I've been called by elders who are considering you to be a pastor, and talk about the kind of patience, or how do you make it through that time where the internal call is there, but the external call hasn't come yet?
I think it's important to realize that, the Lord is sovereign, and He loves His church more than we do. So Jesus, as head of the church, isn't wringing His hands and saying, man, if I only had a couple more guys, oh man, like He's actually doing great when it comes to running the world. And so just knowing that, I would use the example of like, I would like be sitting on the couch, right? And be like, oh, like what, God, like what's your will for my life? Like, what should I do? You know, and actually if I would just pause and smell, the answer would be go change that diaper.
Yes.
Right. It'd be like don't get off the couch and thinking about, oh Lord, like I want to preach more, or like all these things are like, oh, I want to serve you like this or this, and like change that diaper.
Right.
So I would say like, you know, like knowing that God is in control of what's in your hands. Like I always pray for this for our seniors at Covenant every spring, right, and fall, or just in general, right? They know that God's sovereign of the fact that graduation is, you know, this many weeks away, and that you haven't like given them some sort of like godliness free zone where they're just like on pause or in waiting or like in some sort of cryogenic freeze mode because they're just waiting for the next stage and the next stage and the next stage. Yeah, so I'd say that was one thing. And also in terms of more, I guess, like ecclesiastically, I would say the harvest is plentiful and the laborers are few. And I just pray that the Lord would continue to give people an idea of God's harvest. Because I think sometimes, like if someone were to go to the PCA website on churches looking for a pastor, there are lots of opportunities.
Okay.
You know? And then if you look kind of beyond that, Gospel Coalition, you know, kind of churches, things like that, there are a lot of opportunities in service just that, you know, people can prayerfully consider. And that's how I ended up in my current position. I started looking more broadly than I originally would have to just kind of want to say, like, Lord, like, where are you opening a door? But I would say, you know, certainly just like that confidence that God is in control, he's taking care of his church, right? And that even as once you are a minister, you're a Christian first. So like living life as a Christian is going to be the best thing. You know, like if you want to work out and like keep healthy, I think Paul would say that's of some value.
Yeah, I think he did say it.
But I think godliness is of value in every way.
Yes.
Right. So that's how Paul talks about it. If you think of like discerning the will of God in Romans 12. Yeah, just that it is a work, so people should expect it to be difficult and easy. That's something I was comfortable in some of the books on pursuing ministry, and I do find Bobby Jameson's on Aspiring to Ministry the most helpful of the ones I've read. Yeah. But it kind of saying you should expect it to be hard while you're in the in-between. When you have this aspiration and no current called ministry opportunity. So don't assume that pain, suffering, questioning is a sign that you're doing it wrong or that what you've experienced and what people have affirmed in you aren't real. Yeah.
Well, that's a good word for those that are being called at that point to wait.
Yeah.
So you're part of that first generation of kind of classical graduates around the country. You know, if you think about a generation of 20 years, it's certainly true.
Yeah.
And it's always interesting to me, how did the education that you received here at Veritas, how has it been helpful to you as you pursued this calling? Yeah,
so logic is an important field of study.
Yes, it is. No,
right.
I got.
So kind of,
I'm
like,
agreeing. I'm not in
like
my head.
objectively speaking, like just kind of recognizing that truth is that which accords with reality.
Yes.
Right. And
whoa.
Reality,
John, that's a radical statement in our day.
I know, but if things go radically wrong if you don't embrace it.
I know. So
truth is that which accords with reality, and so logic teaching that it's not up to you, like your feelings. I think I wrote about this maybe in Blessings of Classical Education. I don't know if I forwarded it on to Veritas or not, but when I started at Covenant, I just reflecting like I am an alum of a classical school now, leading the upper school of a classical school. What are some of the blessings? And logic is one of those blessings, and like I talk about that certainly in terms of study, knowing that there is a way that thoughts and evidence will line up to produce a conclusion that is reliable, and there are ways that are deceitful.
Yeah.
And so the fact just knowing that and the reliable ways are accessible. It's not a mystery, it's not a power play. It's in the reality that God has made. You know, it's in the race, the reality. And so that's been helpful in so many ways. Academic study, like ways to just like sniff bad arguments, right?
Yeah. And there are a few of them out there.
Yeah, or honestly, just you need to make it more personal. The way to sniff bad preaching, or even just like weaker preaching, because sometimes people will preach the truth from a text that doesn't say that truth. It says a different truth. So, but it just kind of like the logic is important. But I also say psychologically, is in college, I went through some very deep, dark seasons of depression or whatever. It was a blessing to realize that, no, my emotions don't define reality. Like, hallelujah, my emotions don't define reality. There's a reality outside, and actually I logically know what's true, even if I don't feel any of it right now, and it seems like it's just not true. So logic, I think, is a great blessing, and I try to rehearse that with our alum at Covenant as well. And just that the logic is a blessing. And another thing would be, and this I saw really helped me in college, where I had a faculty that I was going to be really blessed if they shaped me holistically. Like, they were honest thinkers. They were careful thinkers. They were going to push me to make good, careful arguments. They were going to say, interesting claim, you haven't backed that up. Just the fact that I had from Veritas, from some of our discussions, some of the expectation of discussion, right? And you couldn't hide back in the day, right? Like, it was me and 6 other people and then the teacher. Yeah. Right? When I graduated, I think there were 37 people in 7th grade through 12th grade.
Wow.
So it was a different season, but the core conviction that education is something for you. Just so, like, I was expected, I need to bite on this. Mm-hmm. I'm not doing it because, it's a game. Right, like it can be fun, but like basically it is for me. So I need to be engaged. This can be a joyful, profitable, enjoyable endeavor that again is for me and should apply to my life. So I'd say that sort of personal ownership, engagement in education, in classes, in discussions, and ideas was good. Now I would say I made it more of an entertainment thing. Right, sort of like edutainment or whatever, where I'm like, oh, ideas are fun. And I think that continued for a while, and it wasn't until I interacted some with just even like other faculty member here, where it would sort of be like, no, like thinking isn't just a game, right? Like there is truth. Like the goal is not, right, like, that's deep. Yeah. Oh, it makes me, think like in this way. Like I always use the bad example of Stiva, right, in Anna Karenina. Yeah. Right, where he talks about how he liked his newspapers the way he liked a cigar, right, for the buzz it made in his head. Right, so as people can engage in intellectual conversations and just to have it be like, oh, that's fun, that's entertaining. I would say it definitely took a while for it to seep down to like, nope, again, like reality, like it's not a casual thing to be a human in the image of God. Like we need to just embrace and seek to truly follow him in the life that he gives us. It took a while for that to sink down, but a core conviction that Veritas gave me was education's good. Like it's for me. I should bite and chew and swallow.
Yeah. When you were talking about some of the things you were writing in college, and it sounds like there's this thing that I've noticed about students that here at Veritas, they try to say a bunch of true things and then just stop. And I'm like those are all true. Yeah. Those are all true, but
well, praise the Lord that you guys have been changing things since I graduated. Right? Well, let the record show I was asked to write 50 pages as a high schooler, and that is a foolish thing to try to ask. And like
we've repented.
Yes. Thank good. I brag about your repentance, even as I tell people stop complaining. I had to write 50.
You know when that repentance began? The first time I started grading a 50-page paper.
Let that be a note to administrators as well. Right. Asking your teacher to do something is a little bit different when you do it yourself.
Yeah. So I went home with 3 papers one night, and I said, I'll have them back to you tomorrow. And I remember my face, waking up with my face, plastered on a paper that I'd fought, the first paper that I was halfway through, that I'd fallen asleep on. And I was like,
Yeah, 50 pages of foolishness is too much for any teacher to handle in one.
Well, and part of the writing process is you don't write well out of the box. You have to practice and practice. But I think that the fun thing for me is that the students that come from classical schools typically aren't as frightened when they get to college to wade into that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they can
that was true for me.
They can get through that awkward stage of writing.
And writing is so important for that because like the whole write the with the work, and that's one thing that again. Grove City College History Department. You got to write a lot of papers, and it's a labor of love that they really grade them. They really read them. They don't just give a check mark and say, oh, look, you were coherent. And so like that kind of fire of writing, again, makes you realize, like, I need to be able to articulate truth to people. It's not just for me to entertain me. I need to be able to say it to other people, because the Lord calls us to, be loving, serving, thinking people, right? Not just
thinking.
We can, yeah. Like, so I've been transitioning into being a pastor for a while. So when I was doing teacher in service, like, there was a season when I just like led them in a teacher in service through the book of Haggai. And so I said, like, what kind of building do you think you're building your students into? Right? Like, obviously, like, we're not building them to a factory. We're not building them into a, office complex. But I would say, sometimes in the classical Christian school world, we can be tempted to think that we're building them into some sort of like Wendell-Berryan, like, cottage/library, right? Where it's like, oh, wow, look, like, it's so pastoral and nice, and there must be so much deep thinking, and, and it's like, no. Like, we're building our students into a temple, right? A place where they worship God and where others are invited to. Yeah. So.
Wow. So the phone.
I know.
The phone hadn't rang yet. So you just started.
Exactly. No, I just
started pastoring the people that were around you.
No one was really. They're like, okay, yeah, like when you do like a 4-part teacher in service through the book of Haggai, and again, I think it was pretty good, but it was like, yeah, I was preaching at him.
Yeah, you're scratching an itch.
Yeah.
Now you've moved from being a secondary dean to being now a minister. So you still have families and children and young people and teenagers.
Yeah.
So in light of your own calling, how are you going to be working with helping people, whether it be adults who God is calling someplace else, or whether to a change of direction, or, those young people who are trying to sense what God's calling them to do? What advice would you have for people? Because I know you and I both believe that all legitimate callings are godly callings. There's not that we shouldn't draw this sacred secular distinction between what you do and what Mr. Urban, our custodian, does. All of us are doing those things for the Lord. So when that young person or adult is, how would you counsel them to be sensing God's calling?
Open up their Bibles and go to church.
That's
right. As far as the Lord gives a call to his people, right? Because, there is someone there is a voice behind that call, right? And so you want to have it be God's voice, right? And God has revealed himself in all of creation, right? So getting to know the intricacies of how that works out in physics. Like, I'm very thankful for engineers that make bridges that don't break, right? Or just figuring all that. But I understand that it's God's call. So like going to his word. And I think sometimes people need to somewhat despiritualize some of their other decision making and realize that, yes, it's all spiritual in the sense of God, who is a spirit, is ordaining all things and whatsoever comes to pass. So it's not an accident, right? Like that.
The person that he's going to make to build a bridge, he's gifted with mathematical.
Yeah, or just that they grew up and and again, from our perspective, arbitrarily, their parents or grandparents gave them a Lego set and they just dove into it and loved figuring that out. Because even though when people sometimes use the word of calling of oh, I'm called to be an engineer, it's I think it can be dangerous because it's you're called to be a Christian.
Yeah.
Right. And so your family life, your church life is not incidental then to your calling. Now, again, I am gifted and equipped most to serve people and enjoy myself being an engineer. But again, I think it just the word of calling can sometimes add, I think, more weightiness to oh, I need to figure this out, and also a little bit of more weightiness of, well, I'm not really doing my calling. My calling isn't really mopping floors. As opposed to well, yeah, you should look to God for your calling, and He will give you a piece of that in mopping floors to His glory and serving people, right? Honestly, may one lasting thing from the pandemic, right? A lasting thing from the pandemic be that people value custodial services.
Absolutely,
right? Cleaning things, things or whatever, right? Just that this is an honorable task, right? So I say, as people are figuring out their calling, they should look at themselves to a degree. Say, what am I gifted? What am I not gifted for? And just realizing that, they can change that to a degree. So young people, right? are they aspired to equip themselves more in an area? And so they want to pursue training or, vocational like school, just who naturally are they? And that can be, background, desires, like all sorts of things. But I think they need to take seriously that some of these things are their desires, their abilities, their gifts, and that God is sovereign over those things. And so they should seek to put them to use in his kingdom and God glorifying ways. I recommend a resource there so someone can go to CrossCon and go to their press resource. So that Cross Conference is geared for 18 to 25-year-olds as far as people engaging in worldwide evangelism and missions. And they just have a lot of good resources on how should young people figure these things out. So they have good resources. Kevin DeYoung has a book called Just Do Something, which is on decision making. James Petty has a book called Step by Step, a guide to decision making. And again, James Petty's the one where I stole from the idea that God's not sending you on a treasure hunt, right? Where it's sort of like, watch for the clues, right? Oh, you might miss them, like watch out, or you might miss God's will for your life. Like that's just not the God that we see in the Bible. And I want to throw in another snippet there from Chris Walker when he got it from the Bible, but I just want to give him credit.
That's your pastor.
Yeah, the pastor at Westminster Presbyterian Church. And he said how we often emphasize how do we become a good decision maker, right? Just kind of like focusing on ourselves. And hey, Proverbs would have you stuff in there for being a good decision maker. Yeah. But the Bible, in its relation of people's life and faithfulness, focuses a lot more on just like what is the field that God's put you in? What are the doors that he opens? Yeah.
So you've got young people trying to sense their calling, but then you also have parents who are very interested in helping their children find that calling. Would those be good books, or is there other advice that you would give to parents?
So I think for $2 at ccef.org, they could get an article by David Powelson called "What Is Your Calling?" And that's pretty good.
Okay, well, it's pretty inexpensive. Even a Lancastrian will buy a $2 thing.
It even has a worksheet at the end to work through. Now it's connected to counseling ministry, other things like that. But the questions that he asks of like, what are you good at by God's providence? What experiences do you have? What desires do you have? And then also just like, what is before you?
Yeah.
Like, what is possible? So I think those are good resources. Parents, I feel like I have a whole other thing for parents.
Maybe another podcast someday?
Sure, maybe another podcast.
Maybe. One last question, and this is, I just want to pick your brain as somebody who's going off in the beginning of your ministry, and I'm not talking about a particular denomination, but as you look at the landscape of the church right now in a culture where logic and reality are really being challenged, what do you see as some of the big challenges in the future, the next 20 to 50 years of the church?
I'd say the distraction of the busyness of prosperity. So I know that's something new, but, and just thinking about the Lord isn't wringing his hands and all of a sudden thinking, man, if I'd known that my people would face like a radical transgender movement, like I would have added another book to the Bible.
Sure.
If only, right? So like he actually has given.
I forgot that one.
Yeah, right. He's actually given us sufficient resources in his word to handle life. And so I think looking to the Bible. And so if the Bible doesn't ask a question, maybe we shouldn't be asking the question, or at least we should let the fact that we are asking a question reveal more things. So the Bible doesn't ask the question of how can you serve God faithfully if your worldview is no longer culturally dominant? Like the Bible doesn't ask that question. It kind of makes the assumption that like if you're in holiness seeking after me, it won't be dominant.
Yeah.
And you know who is dominant? I am. So just like you can take me at my word.
Yeah.
And so I think the busyness of prosperity, right? Just in terms like we have so much opportunity, so much stuff that it can just prove a really
can choke things out.
Terminal distraction.
Yeah.
And hey, I'm very, very thankful that there are very busy people working very hard. But that's why I say the busyness of prosperity, because yeah, it's just very easy as families. Heidi and I are just beginning to enter this. We've seen some families thankfully model thoughtfulness towards it well, of just wow, like soccer camps that cheap. Like, that's cool. Like, we can go to that, and that's why, like I said, maybe we should do another podcast on parents.
That sounds like a really good podcast.
Their vision for their children, because I have stuff to say, but I don't know if you want me to go off into my mini spiel now or not.
Well, let's save that one up. But the way you talk about the distraction that we can have in prosperity, I don't know if you and I talked about this back when you were a student or a teacher here, but I always think it's kind of interesting that Christians freak out every time there's a economic downturn here in America. And I'm downturn in scare quotes, because the rest of the world would love to have what life is like during a downturn here in America economically. And they kind of think it's like the end of the world. And I remember talking to one of my finance committee members during the Great Recession of 2008 through 2010, and he said, no, it's not bad enough for people to really rethink life yet. My worry is not that America will fall apart in the next 5 years. It's that it won't fall apart in the next 150 years, and we just keep heading into a deeper and deeper level of self-reliance instead of saying we as a people really aren't oriented toward the God who's given us this blessing. We've become that other side of the parable of the city on the hill.
Yeah, that's right. I think the idea of going to God in the midst of it, right, is the most important thing.
Yeah.
And just so kind of like pushing out God, because you mentioned it being really, really bad, or not really bad, or right,
not
and
bad
just
enough.
Well, just that in God and His mercy, right, doesn't look down on anyone who actually just takes the time to call out to Him, right? If you look at like Hannah, right, when she's just sad over not having a child, right? Like, God, like we sometimes be like, Hannah, get some perspective. Like you're a woman in the ancient Near Eastern world whose husband affectionately loves you, and like you're really, really wealthy and taken care of. Like, okay, I know it's hard, but that's not how the Lord approaches her at all. So He doesn't kind of say, "Oh, is this amount of suffering worth calling out to me?" Or is this kind of, so it's always great to turn to God. That's always the right call.
Yeah. The Psalms are things that push us in that way too. So, John, so wonderful to talk to you today. Thank you for coming on, and may God bless the calling that He's given to you, and may you have the courage that I fear you're going to need as a minister in the next 20 years, 50 years, however long God calls you to be a minister at this place. So thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Cultivate, the podcast of Veritas Academy, a preschool through 12th grade classical Christian school in Leola, Pennsylvania. If you would like to learn more about Veritas, please visit veritasacademy.com to discover the truth, beauty, and goodness of classical Christian education.